Welcome to the Heritage is Living podcast, a place to explore and challenge what heritage is and how it fits into our world today. Through this podcast, we'll speak with experts in the heritage field and beyond to understand how heritage can help us to live aware, with care, and with purpose. This podcast is recorded in Ottawa on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Trust works on the lands and territories of many Indigenous peoples across what is now known as Canada. I'm your host, Patricia Kell, Executive Director of the National Trust for Canada. On this episode, we are discussing the connection between heritage conservation and the housing crisis in Canada with Graham Cubitt. Graham Cubitt is an affordable housing developer, having led over 20 projects, creating more than 1,000 homes with Indwell as Director of Projects and Development. Graham helped launch Flourish in 2021, a not-for-profit development services company that deploys Indwell's accumulated experience in creating affordable housing and social purpose real estate projects. Roughly half of Graham's experience is in adaptive reuse projects, including numerous heritage buildings. Graham has also become a Canadian leader in developing projects to passive house energy performance standards. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, great to be with you, Patricia.
So let's begin by talking a little bit about you. So how did you get involved with affordable housing development?
Well, I was a housing support worker with Indwell, providing direct tenant support to people who were in Indwell's housing. Mostly, Indwell's housing focuses on people who are living through mental health or addiction, looking for sort of recovery, focus on sort of rebuilding their lives. And we know that housing is a key element of that. This was like pushing 20 years ago now. There was lots of us advocating for more housing to be built, more solutions to be created. That was falling on deaf ears. And so at one point we realized, like, well, if somebody's going to build the housing, maybe it needs to be us. And so gradually we figured out what it would take to become a housing developer. And, fast forward to now, I think Indwell is the largest developer of supportive housing in Ontario and perhaps in Canada.
That's an amazing transition. And so as part of that housing development portfolio, you have worked on some heritage buildings or older buildings, existing buildings. And so how did that transition happen?
Some of it is just opportunity. Some of it is necessity. Some of it's ambition. I mean, the reality is that we have a lot of buildings in our communities that are not being used or not being used well. And so for Indwell, I think maybe it was our second major project. The first project we built was some sort of typical standard townhouse style apartments. The second project we tackled was an old bar conversion, and it was a situation where there was sort of an operating bar. The cops said they would never show up there with less than 5 officers. The neighbors constantly complained about drug dealing out the back door. It was just one of those places that had become a home of last resort, kind of a rooming house over old tavern kind of situation. So we purchased that property and then sort of set about rebuilding it. We took it back to the bones and then added a third story and created 46 new apartments and a community development center. So that was our first foray into kind of larger scale development, but also happened to be, taking a 1949 landmark tavern and turning it into new supportive housing. So we set off on kind of a course that said, well, we'll tackle anything. And I think maybe our third or fourth project was a 1911 knitting mill, an old Harvey Woods knitting mill that had been let go for about 20 years. And so it just stood there vacant. Now many people say that it's our most beautiful building. It's truly stunning, but it's one of those situations where a lot of the community sentiment was like, oh, it's too far gone, tear it down. So I think that over time we've realized that there's a lot of diamonds in the rough, so to speak. There's a lot of opportunity out there in buildings that exist, and we're pragmatic to say that not every single building should be kept or has the ability to be saved or converted. And so we do look at things on a case by case basis.
So just to sort of be clear in the context of this podcast series, which is talking sort of centered around heritage issues. In the case of Indwell, the primary interest is about housing. It's about providing supportive housing. And the heritage is just a happy way to get there.
We would probably go a bit further than saying it's a happy way to get there. Our goal as an organization is to see lives restored. And we do that through delivering supportive housing, developing supportive housing. So our goal is to find opportunities, find physical spaces so that we can create the housing. And when we can do that by, returning a landmark building or a building that has like strong like community memory attached to it, if we can bring that back to life at the same time, it often actually enhances the experience of those who then end up living there. And so the idea of, for people's lives, we don't just say, well, tear it down and start again. We say, what can we do to rebuild off of your strengths? In some ways we see buildings the same way, that simply assuming that we should tear them down in order to start again doesn't align with our values. We're not a heritage developer, per se, but about half of our projects have been adaptive reuse of old buildings, and often sort of buildings with heritage value.
I think that's really a lovely image to be building on the strengths of the individual, but also then of the building, and to sort of apply that philosophy broadly. So maybe we could talk a little bit about your project at St. Mark's in Kitchener. So can you tell us a little bit about how that project developed?
Yeah, so St. Mark's Place just had our grand opening very recently. It opened as a facility in late 2023 in terms of tenants starting to move in. It was one of three buildings that a Lutheran church that became known as Trillium Lutheran Church merged three congregations. They had two redundant buildings. This one was a great location. It's right on the LRT in Kitchener, right next to Grand River Hospital. It's a great location, and typically in Kitchener and many communities the same. Large transit investments lead to large condo developments. Very little affordable housing, in fact. And so the church was keen to see their property used in a way which extended the mission of the church and its presence in that community. It had been there for close to 100 years, maybe even, close to 100 years. And they wanted to see it turned into something that would kind of continue their legacy, even though they wouldn't be using the building, because the decision had been made to sell it. So when they started exploring different options, Indwell supportive housing came onto their radar. There was some hesitancy at first, well, would this be appropriate or the right fit? And through various conversations, some tours of other facilities that Indwell had developed, the church came to, yes, this is what we want to do. And in fact, they made the commitment to sell it at half price to Indwell. So that kind of got the ball rolling in terms of the fundraising efforts and the community acceptance. And then from there, it was like, how can we reuse this facility, which was very beautiful. It's like a classic, cruciform style, high roof slope, the classic church. And had been very well maintained by the congregation. So how to take some of those physical attributes and yet change it into housing. And so it was maybe about a year's worth of conversation to think that through, different design iterations, heritage studies, community, conversations, working with City Hall, all the rest of that. And in the end, it became pretty obvious that we could actually repurpose the church hall, and various, to 3 or 4 additions along the way, create most of the housing, create all of the housing outside of the main sanctuary space, and actually retain that, that nave for community access. And so it became sort of an iterative design process, like everything, but really influenced by the community's interest in keeping a community space available to the neighborhood and to the tenant community there.
So you mentioned that the congregation was willing to sell this church at half price to you, and I'm really interested in how Indwell makes supportive housing projects financially feasible. So, I mean, often we hear that working in a heritage space is more expensive and there's a lot of uncertainty, and therefore people are reluctant to go down that road. But obviously, you've done many projects. You've got a formula that works. So, are you willing to share a little bit about what are the critical components that lead to a successful project?
Yeah, yeah. In order to make any project work, there is a little bit of formula and a little bit of perseverance. I think cooks say good ingredients matter, and I think that we would say the same thing. There's not really a recipe per se for these projects, but we know that the same kind of core ingredients go into each project. Heritage projects do have a reputation for like costing like a lot more, but I think when we look at the numbers from our experience, they're not actually that much more at all. Where you invest though is in different areas. There is a longer design process. So you pay a little bit more upfront maybe because you have to get more studies. You have to do more sort of selective demolition or testing of materials or figuring out a way to deal with thermal bridging or finding windows that work, or you have to do more research up front than just sort of assuming a blank slate and starting ground up. In the end though, we don't think that it's dramatically more expensive. It's always hard to get numbers from other projects. Nobody ever wants to tell you their numbers, but they'll be quick to criticize yours. We recently, though, did compare a project that we're working on in London. It's a hospital conversion, an old hospital conversion. The cost per square foot is a little bit higher, but in the end, the cost per unit to a new build, conventional construction project next door is $1,700 more per unit. So in the end, is the cost that out of line? It's not out of line at all. Um, but what we're building is somewhat of a different product. And so, I think part of it is with supportive housing. We are often able to deal with more modest sized units. We're typically supporting single person households. So we have a lot of experience building, one bedroom and studio apartments. Now that is cheaper in some respects, but it has, there's more cost, just as many mechanical systems, just as many electrical systems in a small apartment as there is in a bigger one. So your cost per square footage seems to go up, but the overall costs are definitely in line. I think one of the other areas, though, that one of the reasons we have been successful with adaptive reuse and heritage buildings is because supportive housing can be of a more modest scale. It doesn't have to rely on economies of scale. We don't need 100 units in order for the project to work. Actually, we don't usually actually want 100 units, just in terms of being able to create a knowable community to be able to foster that sense of identity and belonging, etc. So these buildings, these structures, because they are quirky or they have unusual physical characteristics, that can be accommodated quite feasibly within a supportive housing project. So I think that there's maybe an advantage in some respects to using the supportive or affordable housing program as the basis for the conversion of some of these buildings.
That's super interesting. It's clear that creating community, or the community that emerges at the end of the project in the building that is rehabilitated, is a key consideration. So do you think there's and I think you've maybe sort of referred to this somewhat, but that the relationship between having an existing building with its character and building community?
I think that there is definitely value to the legacy memory associated with heritage buildings that our tenant communities benefit from, and in turn, our tenant communities actually extend that broader community memory of these facilities because they continue to use it as a community facility. I think that for a lot of Indwell's projects, Indwell's mission is to create affordable housing communities for people seeking health, wellness, and belonging. And so a lot of the work is around promoting health, around creating a sense of community, around reconnecting people to their social, their personal, their networks within the neighborhood or the community they call home. And so part of that is creating the physical spaces for gatherings, for meals, for events that are outside of people's homes. In normal apartment buildings or normal commercial projects, you really try to minimize that sort of non-residential space because you can't sell it. You need to keep that at as low a percentage as you can. Whereas for Indwell, it's often 30% of a building might be these community spaces. And so having a church hall that gets converted to a community hall, having a former loading, shipping, receiving dock that gets converted to an atrium, these are not wasted spaces in a heritage building. They're actually become the kind of the heart of the community for the housing community. And then those spaces are often actually opened to the broader neighborhood for everything from like AA meetings to birthday parties to polling stations to community events. Those are some of quite a large range of like groups come in to use spaces. Community kitchens, catering companies have gotten started from our community kitchens. These are things that happen because the spaces are created that are like truly multi-use, kind of like old church halls often were, or other kinds of spaces. So I think it's really an important part of um, fostering the community memory, so the looking back community memory, but also creating new community memory, for subsequent generations by repurposing these buildings. But I think that one of the challenges we often run into is like the the creativity break of economics. If there's not a clear economic driver for something today, is it worth doing? And sometimes we have to find the creativity to overcome that barrier.
So I guess I'm wondering then in your business model, so once you have tenants in the building, you presumably have some rent that comes with that, some income related to that. And so is there sort of a long-term, I guess I'm still wondering exactly how the economics of this play out. So clearly Indwell is a not-for-profit, so there are some charitable donations, but there's obviously other aspects of the financial model here going on.
hmm So we break things out into two sides. Obviously, like the capital cost to get something built, you got to find those funds one way, and then the operating cost to keep a project running or a program running. On the upfront capital side of things, donations are always the backbone of projects. Nobody, we always say governments follow, they don't lead. So you have to get the ball rolling with community support. Once you've figured out that this project, has a viable path forward according to, some sort of plan, then, federal CMHC funding or, provincial programs or municipal funds can be aligned to create that housing. Now, they don't pay for community centers under those programs. They don't pay for, auditoriums or things like that, but they do pay for tenant amenity spaces. So if we can have a double purpose space that, by day gets used as tenant amenity and in the evenings can become a community hall, that's okay. And so we often have to work really hard to make sure that we're designing buildings that are truly residential communities, but may have additional support, like additional purposes or usability. On the operating side, and then the goal is to like minimize the financing of the project through, grants, obviously, in order to keep the cost of the housing in check. On the operating side, because we've secured a significant amount of the project's cost through grants, then rents can stay low. And that's the key support that Indwell offers to tenants is rental affordability. On top of the rental affordability, though, donations continue to be an important part as a charity. And then depending on the program model, if there's a lot of health supports offered or such, then those would be maybe funded through like a Ministry of Health type service. So The operational costs of the housing program really are rooted in the housing services that are delivered, both the rental apartments and the supports. We don't really, you know, we don't really rely on or count on a significant amount of revenue from these community, based sort of rentals. In part because they're often not sort of like long-term locked in, and usually they're community groups that don't have much money to pay for anything. So we don't usually count on those as like a key economic, like an anchor tenant. But if we have the space to share, then that becomes something that's available to the broader community at cost recovery kind of rates.
Right. And so in at least some of the project, is there both supportive housing and then commercial housing?
Up till this point, no commercial housing. It's all supportive housing
It's all
and
supportive
therefore
housing.
all affordable. Yeah.
Okay.
There are projects that Indwell's done. I mean, there's about over 20 like commercial tenants, pharmacies, cafes, library, many different sort of types of tenants. That would usually be in situations where it's like a commercial, like a building in a commercial area, main street type facilities, or context where you need to have ground floor commercial according to the zoning. And so then those would be like a commercial paying tenant. You're obviously making money on rent if you're renting to a pharmacy, uh, but that wouldn't necessarily be a common element across all projects.
Right. Sorry. And maybe I didn't express myself well there. So I'm wondering if there are residential units that are at market rates.
Not
No, it's all
residential
supportive.
units at
Yeah.
this time yet. Yeah.
Super interesting. I think I find the work that Indwell is doing really inspiring and valuable. And so the possibility of like what as I say, what the formula is to be able to do that in more places is really critical. And sharing that is really critical in terms
Yeah.
of making this kind of vision live more broadly.
Thank you for that. And I mean, in terms of the formula, it's the key elements are we look to create the maximum number of housing units possible in the physical space, especially when you're dealing with an existing building. Often a heritage building has like quirky structure. It is what it is. You can't move the structure around too much without sort of like significant cost. But you work within that. And you can create unusual or very interesting, compelling spaces, places for people to live. So then we would look to if we whatever we can do to maximize the number of housing units reduces like the cost per unit in terms of some of your core servicing or your core infrastructure costs because you're dividing across more housing. From there, we then do look what can we save rather than throw out and replace, because then we're saving costs. Structure obviously is a huge one. Um, is there ways that we can fix something rather than replace it? It's often, I mean, it's so popular in our culture. Just think like it's cheaper to replace, cheaper to build new. It's not cheaper. It's just maybe easier, or it takes a different skill set. But if St. Mark's is a great example, to keep that auditorium, we also wanted to bring the whole building to Passive House standards. So we had to look for ways to create air tightness for an existing sanctuary. Well, there's technologies out there for air sealing and approaches without having to gut the space and re-insulate it that we could adopt. And it's just like a little bit of a different process to get there than it is to, than conventional. But it meant that we could keep all of the heritage attributes, the wood, the stained glass, the plaster, etc., and keep that in place. So it meant that we didn't have to, one, pay for demolition, or two, pay for the replacement of all those materials. So I think part of the formula is really assessing what can be kept and therefore save some money, and not have to be replaced, therefore also saving some money. And at the same time, you're keeping those visual features, those physical features, that may actually be what people see as the heritage value.
Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about what maybe needs to change in order to make doing projects like these. So using heritage to create affordable housing more attractive. So what are the big barriers that prevent more projects like this from proceeding?
I think that from a developer perspective, we have to become like less fear based. We need to like approach these kind of projects with more of an open mind about the possibility. We need to stop trying to find the engineer who will write the report saying the building's about to fall down. We need to find the engineer who says, here's the path to fixing it in a cost effective way. I think that on a practical level as well, figuring out business plans that break even rather than make a lot of money. A lot of these buildings are not going to be cost effective to preserve and make 20% on it as profit, because the market just may not be there to drive those kinds of business plans. But the potential to create housing within them is still very real. And so, maybe it's just some developers are better suited to the task than others. I think that that's where the community housing sector probably does need to step up our game as well. Most nonprofits, most community housing providers that currently run social housing don't have a lot of development experience, don't have a lot of like knowledge about how to tackle projects like this. So they're overwhelmed and it's like, oh, that's too hard, too complicated. So we do need to increase our internal organizational capacity, and that's one of the things that Indwell's been working on. We recently launched a new company called Flourish as sort of to extend Indwell's experience to other nonprofits, other community housing providers, so that the learning curve can be shortened. So that's already seen some impact. I think that the other thing that we could do with these kind of buildings is become, heritage, capital H heritage, has a reputation for sort of fixating on the sort of the width of the cornice versus like the reality of people need to live somewhere. And I think sometimes we can become overly focused on the things that may not be really, really important. We're dealing with a situation right now where it's heritage windows. They're expensive to create these large heritage style windows for an old hospital. And the debate is about the angle of the divide in the light and whether it should be a fully divided light or like a faux divide in the glazing, and whether it should be on the outside or between the glass. And we're also trying to make the building sort of like energy responsible, because we do have a climate crisis and we can't just keep burning gas. So these are the kind of debates that sometimes maybe make people shake their heads and say, well, screw heritage, we just need to like get this built and get it built cheap. Well, we don't want to create that polarization, but there does need to be a cooperative kind of like keeping the big picture in mind, and deciding what the big picture should be, and then keeping it in mind as we work through uh, things related to heritage particularly. I think in the end, throwing away our heritage is a bad idea, but figuring out how to sort of like bring it into a new century is pretty important. So being faithful to the past, but also being pragmatic about today is the skill set that I think takes a bit more work to develop.
So when we think about some of the tools that the heritage community has used in the past generation in order to manage heritage interests, including the notion of designation, I'm wondering if you've probably worked both on older buildings and also on designated buildings. What do you see as the impact of that?
It's a lot easier to work on just older buildings, not designated buildings. But we're not opposed to the idea of the designated buildings too. I think that the practical side is, how much latitude do heritage professionals have within their designation, like within their profession, and to be sort of true to the profession when dealing with designated buildings. What flexibility is there, and how do we how do we validate problem solving that may not be sort of like keep it as exactly as it was? Um, Now, of course, there's different approaches to, which is the better way. Should everything just be preserved, or should we be, replicating, or facadism? Go down a lot of rabbit holes here. But I think that when it comes to when it comes to housing conversions, particularly, there are a lot of code implications that need to be need to be addressed: fire separation, structural noise, uh, views of the outdoors, all of these kinds of things, uh, egress. How do we deal with those and figure out the maximum number of things we can do to preserve the designated characteristics? We'd be designated for a reason. This is an important building for some reason. Well, what are those important things, and how do we really maximize those while still acknowledging that there needs to be a business plan that works for the housing? I think the problem is that a lot of our heritage buildings were built as, I don't want to say ego projects, but family X donated a lot of money to build church Y, and that family's no longer here, or that church doesn't have the money, and who's going to put up the money next? And it doesn't just happen on its own. And so when we get locked in these pitched battles, nothing happens, and then buildings just fall apart. So I think that figuring out how to cooperate early is probably important for a lot of our structures versus like fighting about it and then it just kind of dies.
And so if designation is kind of the restricting piece, there are also tools that have been used, like grants or tax benefits. Do you see a role for those, or are there opportunities to use to conceive those in more effective ways in order to lead to better outcomes for people?
Oh, for sure, there would be. Yeah, I mean, one of the areas that is the hardest right now for affordable housing development and for heritage is there's no money up front to study the building, to figure out what can be done, and to advance projects like design, especially in the early stages. That if there was grants that were more available, then I think it would give a lot of projects a leg up in getting to the point of being deemed feasible, to being deemed viable. Um, every level of government wants to be last to the table at the moment. They all want to sort of like fund, you know, the rhetoric is like, shovels in the ground or shovel ready or even keys in the door. Nobody wants to put up the money to get you to a building permit. So that's the hardest possible part of the project in terms of cash flowing design, and for heritage too, to do the studies to figure out like what are we going to do to preserve this brick or to maintain that facade or to deal with windows or all those things. It's really hard to find the money up front. The second thing is, and we don't have this available here, I don't think, but I follow some folks on Twitter in the States, and they've got like these heritage tax credit structures, which really allow a developer to apply to get these grants. I don't fully understand the mechanism just yet, but if we had something like that here, it'd be amazing, because then it would actually create sort of a stream of revenue that we could use to renovate these old buildings and actually create the affordable housing that we need. So it'd be awesome if there was a way, particularly maybe at the federal level, to create this kind of tax structure that achieved two things at once. And I'd love to see something like that explored here.
Excellent, thank you. So finally, let's talk about why making this link between housing and heritage is important. So what is the consequence of making decisions about whether to keep or demolish existing buildings looking through a housing justice lens?
I think that there is a tremendous opportunity to build a lot more housing sooner if we were to cooperate with the heritage community and with heritage building owners, rather than wait for them to make a decision and figure out how to either tear them down, get permission to demolish, or sort of in the absence of a viable use, to sit there waiting to do something. There's so many buildings that are waiting that are sitting available, and I think that there could be a huge justice issue of like equitable use of, in a sense, public resources. Churches, hospitals, a lot of heritage buildings are public interest buildings. How do we transform those into a new public interest, maybe around affordable housing, supportive housing, particularly dealing with the homelessness crisis? How do we do that in a way which is much faster because the opportunity is there and the need is absolutely crushing. I think that would be awesome. And then I think that from um, our population in Canada grew by, hundreds of thousands last year, hundreds of thousands the year before, hundreds of thousands, millions over the next few years. So we need to create housing. This is a major issue. And we don't want to just like wipe out everything we did in the past. And so how do we, as quickly as possible, figure out new uses for the heritage buildings that are no longer needed for the use of the past? How do we figure out that new use for today? And then it, we and then come to the conversation maybe more open-handed. I think a lot of individual congregations for churches, or individual boards for nonprofits, or old hospitals, or even municipalities are pretty closed-handed around, well, we need to hold on to our assets. And it's like, well, what does that look like if we actually were more open-handed and said, how can this be used for the community? I think that would really change the conversation for a lot of the heritage structures, but also a lot of the organizations that want to do something good in our community to find new cooperation.
That's interesting, because my sense is that very often the congregation or other owner comes to a point of crisis, and then a decision must be made. And I think what I hear you saying is there's an opportunity to start that thinking before the crisis happens, in order to sort of move towards that as a model of openness and community use of these places, which, as you're saying, were originally community resources.
Yeah, St. Mark's is a great example. That congregation, the three congregations of that that merged Lutheran church, they all sort of said, look, at our future is this, and we see the writing on the wall. And they decided to have the conversation about their facilities early, rather than waiting until they'd sold, or they'd moved, or they'd let it run down, or whatever. And then that conversation led somewhere. We see it so often. A congregation talks for 10 years about what to do, but they never actually commit to making a decision. And unfortunately, that usually leads to the results of dereliction. People get to that point of crisis and just like, well, we have to walk away, or we have to make the decision this week because the deadline has come. Yeah.
Right. The final question: what can we learn from existing buildings about how to create excellent structures and also excellent communities for the future?
There's a lot there. A lot of the buildings that we have that were put up years ago are fine examples of amazing craftsmanship, workmanship, materials. Not every single one of them. They cut their corners in their day as well. But I think that we can learn from these buildings how construction, how the industry, how technology changed over time. We can learn how buildings went together. We can learn how maybe we shouldn't do some things. We don't need to use asbestos as much as we did in the past. But I think that also a lot of the buildings that hold potential for conversion were built for community, as places of healing. A lot of the hospitals and these kinds of structures, places of community gathering, churches and things, places of food provision, church halls, bars, restaurants. We've done 3 or 4 old bar conversions, old hotels. Like I think we're on to now 2 or 3 old hotel conversions. They were all named the Queen's Arms for some reason, but there's places of hospitality that existed in the past that can be that in the future, but they have to be reinvented to meet today's sort of definition of what's needed for hospitality, what's needed for commercial, what's needed for a place of gathering. I think that those needs exist, but just how we gather changes, how we socialize changes, and so figuring out new ways to do that, new ways to sort of meet those needs change. But I think that they're great examples of creativity, people who were driven by a vision and created something amazing that then became part of our collective memory, our collective experience. And I think that that kind of creativity is just as needed now and just as fun. And so I think that there's real opportunity for us to look at our old buildings with new eyes that don't sort of see them as, a burden, but see them as an opportunity for today's generation.
Graham Cubitt, thank you so much for being with me today. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Patricia, and thanks for the conversation.
Heritage is Living is produced in English and in French and is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on your favorite podcast platform to never miss an episode as we explore how heritage conservation is more than you think.